Well, we want to turn to
Yeah.
another very, very important issue, one that's being put out here in the media quite a bit, uh, at least allegations regarding military relations between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, and Russia vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. But of course, that also spills over into the broader attempt to saber rattle by the United States against North Korea in Northeast Asia. So to help us sort through all these various different things, we are very happy to be joined once again on the show by Jamie Tyberg, who's an organizer with Nodutdol. Jamie, thank you so much for being back with us.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you here. And, I maybe want to start slightly. I mean, there's a lot to be said about, the DPRK Russia and the different things, but I wanted to start maybe just from a framing perspective because there's so many articles about this in the Western media. There's 8,000, there's 10,000, there's all these troops. They're fighting in Ukraine, they're going to Ukraine, and it's all reported as if it must be true because the US and the Ukrainians said so, even though there's no satellite images, there's no corroboration. And it just feels like that's an important part of this entire story is how, at least in the West, it seems you can say almost anything about DPRK and it's just immediately believed, regardless of what evidentiary reality is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you're saying, every major Western news outlet reported on this before they could present any sort of evidence. I think in the past week, though, there have been some claims and the publishing of satellite images, but the reality is that, again, they reported on these claims before they could prove anything, and then the claims alone had the public's attention as being true. And this is largely because the West owns and operates the majority of media and news channels in the world. So they have monopoly on what conversations people are having and how they're framing those conversations. And the DPRK isn't their only target in doing this. Any claims about any country made by the West becomes uncontested truth that they can then use to further their escalations and justify. I mean, most famously, their claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction justified their invasion and war, and still the ongoing escalation in the region. But I think the timing is more interesting because the election is in mere days,
Mm.
and they've really been ramping up media coverage of this in the past week or so. And Trump and Kamala Harris have been divided on the issue of Ukraine. And Trump has, in fact, said that he wants NATO to foot the bill on this war. But by claiming that a third party, specifically the DPRK, which is an easy target for Western audiences, has entered the battlefield on Russia's side, opens up the situation for Ukraine to explicitly request troops from its allies. So it's diabolically strategic because it's a sensational safeguard for the US to protect their plans to expand NATO into Western Europe in the case that Trump wins. Because again, Trump may reduce the military aid going to Ukraine, which so far, from 2014 to 2022, has totaled more than 90 billion in US dollars. And so they're fueling escalations between the DPRK and the ROK at the same time that they're ensuring their plans to expand NATO.
I mean, that's just such an insane amount of money you just said. But if we're going to assume the story is true, right? Like, let's just be generous to them for a moment. Wouldn't it seem incredibly hypocritical that the US media and US politicians are losing their mind and in like a panicked sweat about DPRK Russia defense cooperation when you juxtapose that with the fact that South Korea and the US have this insanely high level of cooperation on war matters? Like, it's like, why is it okay for it to be this way and not this way sort of situation?
Hmm. I mean, for us, the US RK cooperation itself is a provocation of war because their cooperation is not some innocent partnership between two nations. The US uses South Korea as a strategic war base for domination of the Asia Pacific region, just as they use Israel for that same purpose in the Middle East. And now their cooperation has reached a point where tensions on the peninsula are at unprecedented levels. And let's actually compare the two, right? The DPRK and Russia did sign a mutual defense treaty last year. And in it, they pledged mutual aid to each other if either country faces aggression. But on the other hand, if you look at the alliance between the ROK and the US, the South Korean military is under wartime operational control of the US military. So that means if war were to break out, all South Korean troops would be under US command. And it's even more hypocritical because there have always been foreign troops in Ukraine. Even earlier this February, the German chancellor said that there were British and French forces in Ukraine. Last October, the US also admitted to having forces in Ukraine as well. But now that there is these claims of DPRK being involved in conflict, there's massive coverage. And the ROK in particular benefits from these claims because now with the use of the DPRK being involved, the ROK is saying we're going to sell weapons to Ukraine. And exporting lethal weapons to Ukraine would be a boost to the ROK's rapidly expanding arms manufacturing sector. It also increases their prestige and value within the imperialist bloc. And the South Korean president currently is facing multiple crises. There's a citizens' referendum for his impeachment. There's also outrage over the failure of prosecutors to indict the first lady for stock manipulation. And so, manufacturing this sort of international crisis where he can emerge as some sort of hero shores up his political legitimacy.
I really appreciate that you brought up the issue of the DPRK Russia Mutual Defense Treaty because I feel so much of the sort of DPRK Russia relations is like this is just some like evil military war alliance. But I mean, it seems to me in both Putin's visit to DPRK, also Kim Jong-un going to Russia, different things like that, that there's a more wide-ranging element of their cooperation sort of based on where both countries are right now. And I was wondering, if you could give us some context on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The two countries are neighbors, they share a border, and they're not aligned with the US imperialism. So they have historically had decent relations. In 2000, they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Friendship, Good Neighborliness, and Cooperation. And the Mutual Defense Treaty that they recently signed is definitely a new stage in their partnership between the two countries. Now, we don't know the details of this agreement because it wasn't made public, but in press announcements, they have said that the agreement aims to achieve a new multipolar world. And it's also important to remember that this agreement is emerging from extremely hostile conditions that the US has created in that region. The US has been pushing for an agreement between South Korea, Japan, and the US. Now, this agreement escalates openly against Russia and the DPRK, and Putin has said this joint military exercises between Japan, South Korea, and the US undermine peace and stability in the region. And Japan and Russia in particular have, they share waterways and have disputed islands. And in terms of nuclear weapons, I mean, the DPRK only has them as a measure of self-defense, and they developed their nuclear programs in response to the US's ongoing provocations. The US was, again, the first to even introduce nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula and still remains the only country in history to have used nuclear weapons.
Oh, Rania, you're muted.
I have to do this at least once every show. Sorry.
Yes.
Every time. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. So going back to what we're discussing, it's often presented as some sort of crazy idea that the US should negotiate with the DPRK or like want to forge a path towards peace. But, for the average person in the US, specifically like working in oppressed people, is a war drive really in their interest?
Right. I mean, we have to also remember that it's the US in particular that's been the one to sabotage any peaceful efforts to reunification that the DPRK has consistently pursued on the peninsula. And so the fact that we're even at the level of tension that we are on the peninsula is because the US has sabotaged all of those peaceful efforts. Um, and the US government spends an estimated 1.5 trillion annually on war, and is also one of the world's largest weapons producers and exporters. In 2023, South Korea followed and became the world's third largest export market for US weapons. And of course, US war profiteers like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are heavily involved in the construction of new weapon systems in South Korea. And so any sort of escalation or like how close we are becoming to nuclear war in Korea is because the US has an economic interest in it. And it really drives their imperialist aims to be able to control every corner of this world. And I think more urgently, the US military is the greatest institutional polluter. And that has impacts not only today with the extremely active hurricane season that we saw this past year, but that those impacts are going to last through the next several generations. So it's really in nobody's interest, either today or in the future, except for the ruling class.
hmm Well, Jamie, I know that at Nodutdol, y'all are doing a lot to educate and activate people around these issues. Where can they find you all and find your work?
Yes, you can learn more about our campaign at usoutofkorea.org. That has our demands, and it will start being updated with our campaign activities. And you can also follow us on social media at Nodutdol on Instagram and Twitter or X.
Right on. Thank you so much, as always, Jamie Tyberg with Nodutdol for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.